Judge Wilson? Affirmative team?
Yes, thank you.
Let's begin. So we can clearly see that the basic theme of this round is the idea of U.S. strategic interests. Are those interests achieved by maintaining the status quo or by removing Sudan from the state sponsor of terror list? That's ultimately the question today. And so the statement that was made multiple times in the affirmative team's last speech is that the removal of Sudan from the state sponsor of terror list benefits the United States. And my main response to this is that U.S. credibility is harmed. Now, my partner established in her last speech that in removing ourselves from this conflict entirely and just saying that we no longer are going to monitor them with the SSOT list, we are essentially allowing corruption to exist. You brought up multiple pieces of evidence talking about how Sudan has had a history of being corrupt within their government and also associating themselves with other terrorist groups. And as I said in my first speech, there is a real concern of whether Sudan will simply spring back into what they were before once the incentive of the SSOT list is gone. And so what we are effectively doing by removing the Sudan from the SSOT list is we are endorsing that corruption. Because that corruption is something that has historically happened time and time again with Sudan and with other countries that we have put under the SSOT list. That's why it exists. It exists to prevent that sort of corruption, because the SSOT list is an incentive to not be corrupt. If we remove that incentive and they become corrupt, we are essentially endorsing and allowing that corruption to happen. And that's not a trade-off that I believe the affirmative or negative team would agree would be a good one. The next point I'd like to address is the issue of Russia. And the affirmative team again affirmed the idea that Russia will gain control and is going to progressively gain control because since the US has this SSOT list, they'll just turn to Russia for their needs instead. My main response to this follows the pattern of logic both my partner and I have held this entire round. No harm to the United States. No harm to the United States. Again, even if we assume that Russia will indeed be the ones that Sudan turns to, this is the same argument I brought in my last speech, even if we assume that, and even if we assume that Russia's involvement will cause problems within Sudan and South Sudan and within that region as a whole, it does not harm U.S. strategic interests. Now, when the affirmative team discussed the idea of human rights and whether it's worth it for us to pursue those things, they didn't really establish human rights as being a strategic interest until a little bit near the middle of the debate round. And what my partner and I have stood by is that human rights are important, but they must not be the primary emblem of our strategic interest. See, the United States cannot fix every single problem in the world, because we have to have a pragmatic foreign policy that makes sure we have our own interests in mind, and hopefully we can protect human rights as well. However, the harm of Russia being involved, of perhaps human rights being harmed because of a civil war, is completely frankly not a United States interest. Human rights being harmed, we agree, are a bad thing, but having that take place is not something that is a severe enough US interest that warrants the passage of the affirmative team's plan. That concern, even if we assume all those speculative concerns actually come to fruition, does not sufficiently harm the US interests in those regions. The final thing I'd like to address is the main disadvantage, which is that of leverage lost. I have 3 points under this. First is that we cannot influence Sudan's behavior. Like I said earlier, when we take away the SSOT list, they have no incentive to be able to listen to what we want them to do. The second point is that there's no incentive for maintaining progress. My partner established in her last speech that we have attained a lot of progress with Sudan, and we are able to attain a significant larger amount of progress, but only if we maintain that SSOT list, which gives us a lot of leverage in that region. My third subpoint under this is that it allows corruption to take hold, which I, again, addressed earlier on in this speech. Because according to the Council of American Islamic Relations, they said that, quote, the state sponsors of terrorism list is not just about terrorism. It has become a diplomatic tool to win concessions from U.S. adversaries eager to end the stigma and sanctions that come with the designation. We've consistently affirmed how the SSOT list is essential for incentivizing countries such as Sudan to actually make changes and maintain those changes. And because Sudan making those changes that the affirmative team has stood by was based on the SSOT list. If we remove from the SSOT list, there is nothing preventing them from reverting to where things were before. And it is because the SSOT list exists for a purpose, and it best pursues that goal that the affirmative team originally presented, that of United States strategic interests. We urge you to vote negative. Thank you very much.